Welcome to The Memory Game, a podcast where I, Nathan Tuffin,
and I, Rob Beer, exchange voice notes as we carry out the important work of recording an emotional history of video games
for the betterment of future generations. In this episode, Rob gets us to think about the characters we became most attached to.
Hey there, Coziness Obsessive. If you haven't been sat by a tumble dryer in a conservatory, ruining your lungs, and you're still with us, I have another question. As you mentioned in the last episode, you downloaded Baseball Superstars on my recommendation, and I thought it was only fair that I should have a dabble as well. I had a brief go at the 2024 version, which is actually a version that was released in 2019, and they've just continued to roll updates. And it is absolute garbage. They've added way too much. There's no My Batter mode as far as I can tell, so you have to play an entire game of baseball every time you play. It is all microtransactions and menu items and God knows what. And so I went back to the original. 2012 was my favourite version, but that for some reason kept crashing on me, and so instead I had to install 2013, which is the one that you'd started playing anyway because I'd got the dates wrong initially. One of the things that happened almost instantly was that I had a rekindled need to get the approval of the coach that runs the team and is a character that mostly talks you down and occasionally, once a season, every 2 hours of gameplay, says something positive. And that clawing need for approval from a father figure made me think about the attachment that we form with characters in computer games. And so it led me to a fairly simple question. Which are the characters that you formed the greatest attachment to over the years? My first line of thinking in this was a category that I'm calling Don't You Dare Die On Me, which is usually games involving shooting or some sort of combat, particularly where there's sort of permadeath involved. And so the first example that I could think of was a game called Cannon Fodder, which was for the Amiga 600, which had a sort of top-down view. You had 4 soldiers and you were working your way through the jungles. I think it was vaguely Vietnam themed. And one of the interesting mechanics that they did with that was that there was permanent characters. So as you started a mission, there was a long line of soldiers by this sort of hillside, and the first 4 march off to be in the mission, and you play through the mission. And if they survive, then they get promoted. And each of them is named. But if they die, then you're taken back to that hillside, and you can see these little crosses on the hillside representing their graves, and 4 new recruits are added. I think it was made by Q17 as well, which were based up in Leicester, so all of the names that it generates are like English-sounding nicknames like Bonzo or, like stupid stuff like that, as far as I can remember. And so that was the first time that I encountered that sort of mechanic. But the one that I then ended up resting on as my actual answer for this sort of subcategory that I've made was a character that I had in XCOM. They were a Brazilian woman, and their speciality was that they were a sniper. And on really early in one of the missions, I think they were injured and hurt their legs, and so I did some sort of upgrades so that they had metal legs. And so not only were they sort of battle-hardened, but they also ended up with some sort of perk that meant that they were the first character I had that could take 2 shots in a single turn, which in a sort of turn-based game is absolutely massive. And because they were a sniper, they usually hit those shots as well. And so keeping her alive was something that I was emotionally invested in, but also that was absolutely a requirement for me to play the game. And I did the thing where I couldn't deal with her death, so I had to just reload it. Because the consequences of it were that I was going to then keep failing and end up in one of those sort of tunnels where things spiral out of control, and I would have just lost the game entirely. So I did a reload that saved her life a few times. On the opposite end of that scale is the next category that I had, which is which are characters that are mostly useless but in an endearing way. So you're keeping them alive and invested in maintaining them, not because they help you serve the sort of core function of the game or achieve objectives or whatever, but you've become attached to them because they are useless and you want there to be some sort of redemption arc. I couldn't think of any specific examples of this, but it's the way that I will often play things, particularly like sort of strategy games. I remember doing that a lot with sort of Command and Conquer games, where if there was like a lone survivor of some skirmish, I'd try and keep them alive and make sure they were involved in the victory lap. And I'd finally taken down the enemy's base, letting them destroy the last power plant or whatever. But it did spark another Pro Evo 2008 memory from university, which was in the third year in the house that I lived with the boys, as well as doing what I spoke about before of creating that team with the camera where we had random faces. We did another thing which basically invented the ultimate team mode before that was a thing. And this is something we did when we should have been writing our dissertations. We created a spreadsheet of the best players in the game. We then wrote those all out by hand, mixed them into hats by position, and then drafted teams out of that hat so that everyone in the house had a custom team, and then did a league which had a conditional formatting colour-coded spreadsheet to record the results. And so each of us had a sort of superstar team made up of different players. And there was one player that I didn't think was as good as the rest, but was a sort of talisman of my team. And we did the draft twice. I think we managed to complete a league, and we liked doing it so much that we redrafted it. And they were the same. They were one of the only players that I had in both of those teams. And they're a defender, so you're not really supposed to score with them. But I think they maybe missed a few big chances from some corners. And I remember them finally managing to get one in the onion basket. And, feeling like that was a triumphant moment. And it maybe kills me a little that I can't remember the name of that player, but I can picture what they look like in Pro Evo. And linked to that idea of the redemption arc in the category that I've just described is my next category of I need to know that you're going to be okay. And I suppose this has got more to do with story games. So, the games that I've described so far, I'm injecting stories and subplots in larger games, but there are also characters that I've got massively attached to that are just narrative-based games and are the lead characters. And I suppose I thought of this category because of the game that I'm playing at the moment, which is Stray. I briefly described this in a previous episode, but it's a futuristic sci-fi game where you play as a cat. And they've absolutely nailed the movement of that. It's really very satisfying game, just strolling around, jumping up on ledges and spending time scratch posts in a way that instantly endears you to the main character. I have a cat as well, so I'm well adapted to falling in love with cats. And it's set in a world where all of humanity's died out, but on their death spiral, they've constructed a city that was like their sort of last safeguard against a vicious alien-type virus thing that was spreading. But they are outlived by robots who essentially function as humans, so they experience pain and delight and emotions. They've been bunkered down in this sort of underworld, which has a fake sky. So initially you think you're looking up at the sky and the stars, but actually that's constructed to protect them from the outside world, which is sort of desolate. And you as the cat character have been living in the outside, and the fact that you've appeared in the city is a sort of sign to them that life is managing to continue outside of it. So there's lots in there that's about the fragility of life and, I guess, environmentalism. It does that balancing act that you spoke about last time with Frostbite, is that what it was called? Frost Zone? Of being strangely cosy and comforting, despite its dystopian setting, because you exist in these little pockets of tranquility within it. And the game seems to jump between those two modes with these daring episodes where you're trying to strike out and go on exhibitions into the sort of outside world, and then these narrative bits where you just get to explore this quite cosy city populated by friendly and charming robots. And so initially, obviously, the character that I grew to love and care for was the cat, but one of the things that it does nicely is it sort of inverts the owner-pet relationship. So the cat that you're playing at can't communicate, but it has a little robot buddy that helps it talk to the robots. and it's you caring for and rescuing these robots that are acting as humans. And so even though a lot of their responses are fairly automated and scripted, I do feel actively invested in the outcome of what happens to them. So hopefully that game all ends nicely. Apparently it's quite short, 4 to 5 hours, according to the internet. So I'll let you know if it ends all nicely or whether things are grim in an upcoming episode. So yeah, hit me up. Tell me who you care about. Is this finally the time where you get to talk about Rimworld?
Hey, forgotten football talisman. Another great question, buddy, with a simple, straightforward intent that I think will probably come to be the underlying theme of this season. I've had a version of this question floating around in my head for a while now, and I think it's something most people who love video games can relate to. Lots of us form quite strong attachments to fictional characters, which is interesting in itself, I think, but I feel like there is an extra level added when you're also directly responsible for controlling the character and ensuring their success. I really liked your choices, and they rang true with me in lots of ways. I went back and watched a couple of videos of Cannon Fodder because I know that I'd played it before on the Mega Drive, but I just couldn't quite picture it when you were talking about it. And it is just a really simple, straightforward concept for a game. Really just walking around bits of a map shooting enemies as they come at you. It's only a couple of steps up from those old arcade games like Space Invaders and Galaga, where you have a relatively fixed position and then you just point a joystick in the direction of oncoming enemies. And that made me wonder if giving names to the characters in Cannon Fodder was a choice by the developers with the sole purpose of increasing the depth of that game. Because in the simple act of giving a randomly generated name to your little guys, for some reason you do become more invested in them, even though they are basically just tiny pixels on a screen. And that made me think about the Worms series of games, which I'm sure lots of people are familiar with. And I played those loads as a kid. I still play them now sometimes. But how I really loved giving my worms names. And you name the worms, you name the team. And I would often name them after my school friends or like football players I liked at the time or characters from TV. And I very much related to your choice of XCOM and the story about your Brazilian sniper, because it is really easy to form attachments with characters in XCOM, especially if they have a few clutch moments where they win the day for you or like they survive against all odds. And the permadeath feature of that game and the risk of losing them forever does make you more attached to them and makes them more real somehow. And that actually led me to a really early counter question, which is, do you think you're more likely to feel invested in a character if you've named and designed them? Or is it that you're more invested in them if they're kind of generated and designed by the game itself, either as an NPC or like randomly named, like with something like Cannon Fodder? In the Dungeons & Dragons game that I run for you and our friend Sai, two of the strongest attachments that you've formed have been with characters that you've encountered. One, an NPC who fought on your side in a few battles, and another, Hobarth the Hobgoblin, who fought bravely against you, and then you went on to recruit him, and now he's like a member of your party, and he's really a key part of this whole campaign we're doing. And arguably, you both love Hobarth the Hobgoblin more than your own characters, who you've carefully designed and play as all the time. And I really do think there is something in that. I'm not quite sure what it is, but there's something there. I absolutely loved the gargantuan efforts that you and your housemates went to in your Pro Evo 2008 league, especially just given the sheer amount of time and admin needed to maintain it. That kind of effort can sometimes only be mustered for low-stakes passion projects, especially when something more serious like a dissertation is looming on the horizon. And how hilarious would it have been at the time to have made a small documentary about you and your housemates and your Pro Evo efforts, and then shown it to your dissertation tutor, who I remember was somewhat frustrated with you at various times during those final months on our course. Alright, okay, so on to my answers. So when I first heard the question, my thoughts quite immediately went to narrative-style games, ones that would probably fit best in your I need to know you're going to be okay category. And I thought about characters I felt attached to in story-driven games, and ones where I became invested really in what happens to them. And the first one that I could think of was Arthur Morgan in Red Dead Redemption 2, and I think that's probably because I've been playing that game quite a bit recently, and he's just a very endearing character. He's very likeable and easy to root for. And then, as is the case whenever I think about video games, my mind drifted to GTA 4 and just how much I love some of the characters in that game.
Grand Theft Auto.
Better luck next time!
So I know it's a well-made game, and I think the story's probably quite widely recognised as well-written, and probably quite unique at the time in trying to portray elements of the migrant experience coming to America. But I also think I am naturally going to have more of an affinity with some of the characters, purely because I've played through GTA so many times. Clearly, Nico Bellic, the protagonist, would be another obvious answer. He goes through this amazing arc, and he's forced to confront his own demons as part of the story, and he does really have a place in my heart after having played that game so many times. But I think my actual first answer is going to be Nico's cousin, Roman, who you don't play as. He's kind of a side character, but a big part of the story. So Roman is the reason that you move to Liberty City in the game. He's often very tragic, he's quite cheesy, he's sometimes a bit creepy, and he has an inflated opinion of himself, but he's also very kind, and he's often vulnerable, and you get to see him fall in love, and he gets his heart broken. And in the end, he sees Nico's situation far more clearly than Nico does, and he does really try and help him. Even though he's not very violent or skilled with guns, he's not a proper criminal or anything like that. He's just the main character's cousin, really. And I think because Roman is quite hapless and vulnerable and unwittingly thrown into this world of crime and violence, you do really want to know he's going to be okay, which, of course, as regular listeners will remember from the episode on choices in games, is why I always pick revenge at the end of GTA 4. My second choice falls into a category which I would call That's My Guy, and it relates to creator characters that I've made and fallen in love with. An obvious choice for me here would be my regular go-to creator character, Panswago, who also came up in the Choices episode, but as I've used him before, I think I'll go with another one, and it's from the game Blood Bowl 2, which is a turn-based sports game set in the fantasy-style Warhammer universe. I think it's converted from a tabletop game from Warhammer. It's like a very violent version of American football where you take it in turns to have possession of the ball and then you have to try and get it into the other player's end zone, either by running or throwing and catching. But when you sort of interact with and tackle opponents, you can often injure them so they're out for a few games, or even kill them if the dice rolls go that way. So you choose a team from one of the various fantasy races in Warhammer, and then you can rename and sort of redesign the players, and you can also assign them upgrades and skill points and stuff following each win. And so in this instance, I made a team of Norsemen who I think basically they're just like big blonde Viking types. And I looked up Nordic names on Google, and I came up with the team name Halmund's Horn, and then I designed my star player and called him Halmund himself. So it was like this whole team was built around this one guy. So you and I played quite a few games of Blood Bowl 2 together, and it can be really fun, but each game is like an hour long with no way to save and return to it, so it isn't really feasible as a quick multiplayer title to pick up. But I played a few full seasons on my own with Halmund's Horn, and Halmund became my quarterback, or kind of a similar sort of position to that, and I would use him in pretty much every play, even if it was to the detriment of my overall strategy and ended with me losing. And Halmund got injured and battered and bruised, and sometimes whether or not he died came down to the roll of a virtual dice, but he always made it through, and my attachment to him and the jeopardy of losing him definitely kept me playing that game longer than I would have otherwise, even though it was quite flawed in many ways, and wasn't always as fun as it could have been. My third choice is going to be from the game Rimworld, which you finally trapped me into bringing up. Rimworld is the game I've played the most out of all others, I think sometimes to the confusion of other people. I currently have 633 hours of playtime according to Steam, and that's in the last 7 years or so, when I've also had a young family that I probably should have been tending to in some way or another. So Rimworld is a slightly unfortunately named colony management simulator where you have these randomly generated worlds and they're on the outer rims of galaxies. And then you pick a map in a variety of different terrains, and then you can land one or more settlers with a handful of resources, and your objective really is to build up a functioning colony with the means to produce food and defend itself, generate power. You can do things like create artworks and rear animals and pets and just so much more. There is a huge depth to the game, which is one of the reasons why it's so fun. The resistance people often have to it is that it has really, really simple graphics. It's this very basic top-down view, and the characters and buildings are quite cartoony. But I do think having those simple graphics allows it to process and have this complex set of rules, which gives it an immense depth and makes the game really compelling. One thing that's very pleasing about Rimworld is just the colony management side of things. So you have to plan out building and living areas and work out how to get power to your colony. And it's a lovely one for filling up space in your head away from the game as you sort of go away and consider things like how you're going to make space to build a bigger kitchen area, or upgrade to geothermal power, or deal with a nearby colony of pirates. But the true power of the game, and the thing that you have alluded to in the past as my reason for returning to it so often, is its ability to generate stories and then subsequently cause you to feel attachments to your characters, even though visually they are basically just stick figures with a couple of sort of notable features. When you start a game of Rimworld, instead of choosing a straightforward, easy, medium, hard difficulty setting, you choose an AI storyteller, and that can dictate the course of your entire playthrough, really. So the storyteller throws in-game events at you at different intervals, and that's what keeps the game exciting and helps to form these narratives that I've just talked about. The creator of the game actually says somewhere, this isn't really a management sim, this is an AI-powered story generator, and I think it's written somewhere in the menus, like it's not a test of skill here or a challenge. The intention of the game engine is to create stories, and if you're not really here for that, this might not be the game for you. And in my 600 hours or so, I've had loads and loads of characters I've fallen in love with, probably too many to recount or remember, but I'll give a couple of examples and then I'll end on my favourite one. My first example is a character called Swan from a very early game I played. Characters, or pawns as they're sometimes referred to in Rimworld, come with a whole heap of characteristics, so they have skills like building, cooking, plant tending, artistry, as well as combat skills like shooting and melee. And they also have a couple of positive and negative traits, often giving them increased skills or making them unable to do certain things. When you design your first colonists, you can tweak and change some of those things, but obviously anyone you find or recruit to your colony in the game, they just have a set of skills and traits that you have no control over. And Swan was one of those instances. She was someone that attacked my colony, and I sort of incapacitated her and captured her, and then converted her to become one of my favourite colonists. So Swan's positive character trait was that she was a careful shooter, which meant she was really good with guns, and she became my go-to hunter and someone that always got involved in combat. But her negative trait was that she was a pyromaniac, which means occasionally she would just randomly set fire to things. She was also unable to put out any fires that spread like randomly or naturally in the colony. And also, when her mood got too low, she had a breakdown, which is something that all the pawns have, a kind of snapping point where you lose control of them. And her thing she did with a low mood was that she would aggressively start fires and kind of be impossible to stop without violence or arresting her. So the colony usually starts with a pet or other domesticated animal, and you can also tame wild animals on the map if you've got good enough animal handling skill. And at some point, Swan tamed and befriended a wild wolf, who I called Wolf Hat, and the two of them became inseparable. And you can put animal beds in a pawn's bedroom, so they spend loads of time together, and then teach them skills and form bonds between the animal and the human. And that's what happened with Swan and Wolf Hat over the course of this game. So sadly, after a few years in the game, the AI storyteller threw a big attack at me by a local gang of pirates, and several of my characters were shot and killed, including the colony's doctor. And then in the heat of battle, Swan took a shot at a pirate, uncharacteristically missed, and killed Wolf Hat, which was incredibly sad. And the severity of the act sent her into a full breakdown. So she rushed back to the main base and then began setting fires to everything because she was a pyromaniac. All of my other pawns were out fighting the pirates, so they couldn't stop her. And it resulted in my whole base being burned down and a full loss of dozens of hours of in-game time. And to up the jeopardy and make my decisions more meaningful, I like to play Rimworld on Iron Man mode, so you can't load back after you die or make a big mistake and try and take a different course of action, even though I desperately wanted to and absolutely would have done if it were available to me. My actual answer, though, is a character from my most recent and longest running playthrough of Rimworld. His name was Rum, and whereas Swan was AI generated and a character who just happened to join my colony, I created and designed Rum, which is something you can do with the first characters you settle in. And so one of the game scenarios you can choose is called the Rich Explorer, and in that one you start with a bit more money and resources, but just one person, which is very risky because it means you're incredibly vulnerable in the early stages of the game where you get attacked, and it's often valuable to have lots of people around. So I played that Rich Explorer scenario, and Rum was my sole colonist for a good while, but eventually he recruited more people and became the leader of this massive futuristic colony with over 40 people in it, which is very large in Rimworld. There are also various expansion packs which I've got. One which adds royalty and titles to the game. So Rum became the lord of the colony, and he had a throne room and a lavish throne in it made out of like gold or something like that. And there's another expansion called Ideology, and in that you can add belief systems and religions to your colony. So Rum was also the religious leader of this colony, and he had his own temple, again very lavishly kitted out, and his own meditation space, and was basically the central fundamental leader of this whole thing. One ideology that you can implement as you go through the game is called transhumanism, which means your colonists can seek technological upgrades to themselves, like bionic limbs and organs, and doing that becomes part of the happiness of the colony, and it becomes like a key tenet of how they run things. And these upgrades they have can make them faster and stronger and smarter. You can do things like give them a bionic stomach, so they need to eat less. There's something else you can put in them that makes them need to sleep less. Generally, it makes the game easier, but also it's kind of like a fun thing to add in. And so as I got further into this playthrough, I started upgrading all of my colonists, and I kind of had doctors working around the clock, performing surgeries on these little people, upgrading them with powerful new parts. Obviously, as the leader, Rum was high on the list for upgrades, and I began by giving him 2 bionic legs so that he could move around faster and be a more productive leader. But unfortunately, one thing I hadn't realised about him was that one of his personality traits was that he was a body purist, which meant he found any bionic upgrades utterly repulsive. And in practical terms, it meant he was suddenly disgusted by himself and nearly everyone else in the colony, including his wife. So I think I played that colony for about 20 in-game years, and for around 5 of them, Rum was constantly slipping into depressive episodes because he hated himself and everyone around him. And in the end, the only solution was to forcibly remove both of his legs and then have him hospitalized for over a year, while I saved up the money to buy an incredibly expensive genetic serum that could be used to regrow limbs. Eventually, he got new, fleshy, regular legs, and he went back to sort of being in charge. He went on to oversee the colony complete the final game objective, which in this case was to join the court of some sort of galactic emperor. And because he'd been there from the very beginning, and he'd suffered and struggled for so long, I grew very attached to him, and it was quite bittersweet watching him fly away to this new life in the emperor's court. So yeah, long live Rum, and long live Rimworld! I did do a YouTube video about that colony a year or so ago. It has a few other mad stories in it if listeners are interested, so I'll put a link to that in the show notes. Anyway, wonderful question, buddy. Thanks again. Hit me up, hit me back. Much love.
Hey, Hellman himself. Thanks for the answers and counter question. I think I'll come out of the gates with my answer to the counter question, which is that my trend is that I actually get more attached to characters that have been generated by someone else, whether that is an intentional main character in a game or someone that I've plucked from obscurity in the game. And it also, by thinking about that, I realised that a massive clanger from my side is that I missed what will be my full answer to this, which I might save for the Trash Treasure Truck and the post-series, but I failed to talk about Pokemon and the character that I was most attached to ever, which is the Blastoise from my original Pokemon Red game. That is too big an answer to try and to track in here. I've got lots to say. It attaches to lots of things, but that's a teaser.
Trash, treasure, truck.
But to get back to that question, I suppose, I think the character creation process has got more detailed and in-depth over the years, and I find that quite anxiety-inducing. And though I'd consider myself a creative person, I'm not someone who spends a lot of time finessing or considering those character makers. I often go for quite a simple aesthetic, and my names are often, I'm happy to take the name that's been generated and will something out of that, rather than doing what you do, which is come up with brilliantly Anglo-centric and mundane names for all your characters across D&D. And I remember when we played Worms, all your characters had great names. And maybe that's because my creativity is best placed as yes-anding things rather than creating something from a blank canvas. Who knows? Because you're absolutely right. The character in our D&D campaign that I'm most attached to is Hobarth, who we sort of adopted after a scenario where I think we'd sort of slaughtered everyone in some sort of encounter, and they were the sole survivor. Possibly, I think they were the only person that landed an arrow on one of us, and you did a great job role-playing them, and we sort of convinced you to try and invent a process for us bringing him along as a character. And then it turns out that there was a whole mechanic for it that we've adopted and woven into our games. But yeah, that's the character arc that I'm really interested in, because I suppose on some level I think they're real, whereas the character I created, I know that I wrote all the stuff down. I don't know if it's as simple as that. That if I see myself in the characters in any way, then that takes me out of it. Is that a thing? Maybe. I'm not entirely happy that you reminded me of my dissertation tutor and my failings there. I feel like I did quite a lot of reading for my dissertation, but I didn't do a lot of sitting down and writing the thing. And that was more to do with anxiety than it was to do with a lack of effort. And what I'd done is I sort of doubled down on avoidance and hadn't had the conversation that I need to have with my dissertation tutor to just get me out of the rut. I left that way too late, and when eventually I did go and see them, he was a cranky old but charismatic lecturer, and he gave me the speech. I think I might have cried, and he said that there was no rewind button in life, or something to that effect. There's no second chances. Life is not a rehearsal. He said some killer line that I've managed to scrub the exact wording of, but keep the meaning on. So that was worth paying tuition fees for. Like the weighty judgment that has driven my professionalism post that event, I suppose, maybe. I don't know that we would have made a documentary about our Pro Evo teams, but that does very much fit that house as a group. In the third year of uni, I lived with some guys that I had played a sort of five-a-side football team with that I'd set up in the first year with them. And we called the team the South Kinman Sexton Bear Shark All-Star Franchise, which was an amalgamation of all the places we were from. And then the idea was that it was like American sports, like Bear Sharks, and that it wasn't a team, it was a franchise. So we managed to get a second team in the second year, and then eventually turned it into a full 11-a-side team. And at some point, Rich, who did a lot of the sort of wrangling and leading of the team, got it into his head that he wanted to create a MySpace page and try and get 1,000 followers. And so we just we spent like lots of time sending out friend requests, only really getting accepted by Russian models or bots, that kind of weird internet space. But I think that places it in a point in time that it was pre-YouTube, or at least early days of YouTube. One of the other things that we did was that one of the guys, there was a sort of friend from back home of one of the team. He didn't go to uni, so he was working, and so he had like a little bit more cash than we did. And one weekend he came down and he bought the franchise, and we did a sort of like press release recorded on Rich's phone that he'd bought it for £20, 2 crates of beer and a packet of ice poles. And that's exactly the sort of thing that we would have been putting on YouTube or featuring in a documentary, like you said. But I think thankfully, again, we were sort of situated in that pocket of time just before social media and the very early days of YouTube, where I think we were enjoying the weird things that people were putting up, but didn't feel the need to put it on there or try and create revenue streams for it, or whatever journey we would have ended up going on if that had been the time. I suppose I should address your actual answers. Absolutely no surprise to hear GTA 4 getting a mention here. #SaveRoman and #always pick revenge. I did enjoy the key insight that you provided there, that he's not a proper criminal or anything like that, which sounds like a good character reference if you had to represent him in court someday. And again, I'm not an expert on that game. I feel like at some point I will have to play through it so that I can pass judgment on your choices and ethics. I really loved your category of that's my guy. Hammond himself sounds like an absolute boss. And I think you have adopted the correct way of playing that game, which is to adopt a sort of role-playing game attitude towards it. I played Warhammer games in my youth, until I was about 13 maybe, and then I sort of dropped off the map. And I loved American football as a kid, although I didn't have much access to it. I had a duvet set that was American football themed, which I don't understand why I had it, but I did. And so it's right in my inner psyche, American football. And so the Blood Bowl game from that universe, I was sort of desperate to play. And I had one friend when I was younger who had it, but we never got the rules sorted for it. We just sort of couldn't follow how to play it. And so eventually when they created a computer game version of it, I went out and bought it straight away. So I bought it on the Xbox 360, but it didn't have a great online matchmaking thing. And playing against the computer is not particularly satisfying. They didn't really nail the translation of the board game into a computer game. And that's why I think Blood Bowl 2 was so successful, because they'd sort of learnt their lessons and managed to release it at a time where online gaming had sort of tipped over, so that there was a big enough pool of players to play against. As I alluded to initially, I think you're better playing it as a role-playing game that lets stories emerge, rather than trying to play it as a game that you just straightforwardly want to win. Because of the way Blood Bowl works, your turn ends the moment you fail one of your actions, and I feel like that really encourages you to just like grab the ball, huddle some people around it, and slowly, like attritionally, walk your way up the pitch, rather than doing the thing that you want to do, which is like, I liked playing as the Wood Elves. You could get a big tree, like a big Ent character, and as well as being able to pick up the ball, they could pick up players and throw the players. And like all of those things, and this sort of madcap theme of it all, it's really undermined by the fact that your turn ends when something goes wrong, because your odds of succeeding on something like that are so low that it really discourages you from attempting it if you're trying to win. But instead, if you're just trying to have some fun, cause some chaos and let a story emerge from the thing, then you absolutely try that stuff. And I think when we played it with that mindset. As you can hear, I have deep thoughts on Blood Bowl. And actually, I ended up spending, as you know, about a year developing and playtesting a board game that was almost a sort of direct response to Blood Bowl, a futuristic turn-based American football-themed sports game, which at some point I still might try and pitch to some publishers, or maybe when we get to 10,000 listeners, we can kickstart it. Let's see. But to listeners, don't be surprised if turn-based sports games end up on more of my answers in the future. As you mentioned, Rimworld has been circling this podcast, and I've really expected you to bring it up in some of your previous answers. I think maybe you have the sort of GTA fear with it, that if you wanted to, you could use it as the answer to absolutely all of your questions. But it was totally worth the wait for the answer that you gave. I thought you did a great job of trying to explain the core concepts of that game, and had two fantastic anecdotes about those characters. And I think I speak for everyone when I say that we should all take a moment and have a Viking funeral to pause and remember the lives of Swan and Wolfhat. I will push back on one of the preemptive criticisms that you gave of Rimworld, that the graphics aren't great, or at least they're very simple. And I've got to say, I have no desire to see that Rimworld manifested in a 3D world. The stories that you told about your character losing their legs and then being disgusted by their own body and trying to shun the whole society that they'd created, I feel like there's a humorous, jaunty nature to that in a top-down pixel world. But that would be straightforwardly horrific if it was rendered in full 3D. So sometimes these things are a blessing. I suppose your rookie error with the enhancements leader was believing that leadership is all about being more effective by moving around fast, which was your motivation for giving him bionic legs. But I think we can both agree that nothing is more leaderly than enhancing your own legs, cutting them off, and then painstakingly regrowing inferior legs out of principle. Who could say no to someone that does that? On to my research notes quickly. I instantly realised, as I said it, that Cannon Fodder was made by Sensible Software, not Team 17. Sensible Software were a two-person team based in Essex, and Team 17 were from Wakefield, so I don't know who was based in Leicester, but someone was. I'll find that out at a later date. Also, the first four characters that you unlock in Cannon Fodder are Jules, Jops, Stu, and RJ, which were nicknames of the development staff. The names aren't generated, they are pre-scripted. So after Jops, Jules, Stu, and RJ, you get Ubik, CJ, Chris, Pete, Tadger, and Hector. So yeah, I think, to be honest, they do sound like what they are, which is a very sort of English vision of American nicknames. I'm hoping we find another way of getting back to the themes of this question around attachment, or even a question that just allows you to tell more Rimworld stories. There's definitely a novel in the tale of Swan and Wolfhat, but I'm sure that's just the tip of the iceberg.
Today we remember Swan and Wolfhat, valiant souls, dear companions, taken before their time.
Thanks for the memories, Swan and Wolfhat. Gone but not forgotten.
I have one little extra anecdote from that Rimworld colony I described, which hopefully won't feel like we're gorging on too much Rimworld content after a long abstinence. So one of my other favourite characters in that game was a man called Brash, who became a part of the colony because he raided our base in a wave of attacking pirates, and then my pawns injured and captured him, and then over a period of time he was imprisoned and converted and then recruited to become a member of the colony. His jail warden and the person who recruited him was a young woman called Lynx, who was one of my earliest recruits, and I can't remember her original name, but I know that I renamed her Lynx after she was hunted by a wild lynx, which bit off one of her fingers in the attack, but she ultimately managed to kill it and then live on another day. In a really lovely turn of events, Brash and Lynx fell in love, and then they had this big lavish wedding in the colony's temple, officiated by Rum, of course, and then the whole colony had a great big party in their honour, and it was all really nice. That all took place in the early stages of the game, so then cut to the later point where everyone had become transhumanist and is being upgraded with body parts, and one of the main focuses of the colony has become producing enough mechanical components to keep churning out bionic limbs and upgrades. So to do this, I upgraded 3 pawns with specific implants, so bionic stomachs to keep them from needing to eat, circadian cyclers to keep them from sleeping, and these sort of special machine hands to make them better at crafting the complex machinery I needed. I then set their work schedule so they had very little leisure time, and they spent most of their days in the workshop crafting special components. The problem is that characters in Rimworld are a bit like Sims, in that they have certain requirements that need to be fulfilled in order for them to be happy, or they have these debuffs to their mood, and in Rimworld, if their mood falls low enough, they can have these full psychological breakdowns, as I mentioned with Swan earlier on. So I had to come up with a plan to keep the 3 component crafters happy, and that's where Brash comes in. So Brash's character background was that he had been a dancer in a past life, and the practical outcome of that was that he just had a high artistry skill. So by this point in the game, he had become the colony's resident sculptor, and he spent lots of time in the workshop sculpting beautiful artworks that I then used to furnish the base, or I traded them for other expensive items. Brash really liked sculpting, so he was often in a good mood, so I installed him with something called a psychic harmonizer, which broadcast his good mood in a local radius, making the 3 component crafters that he shared the workshop with all happy and lovely whenever he was around. That seemed like it solved the problem, but then of course something bad happened to Brash, I can't quite remember what, but he was sad and his mood dropped, which then dropped the mood of my 3 component crafters, and more importantly, significantly slowed production in the workshop. So to rectify that, I had Brash undergo another surgery and installed a joy wire in his brain. The joy wire is a device that reduces a person's cognitive function somewhat, but puts them in a constant state of euphoria, incapable of feeling down or having a bad mood, which, yes, absolutely does sound like something from a dystopian sci-fi horror movie. So that fixed the issue, and everyone was able to carry on their work and stay happy while doing it, and I was pleased with my problem solving and decided to move on to the next issue. But there was an unforeseen last-minute twist. Brash's wife Lynx was also a body purist, something I hadn't realised, and she was now disgusted with her husband, and it slowly began to ruin their marriage. Because upgrades and surgery had continued to work so far, I wasn't going to steer from that course at this late stage, so I fitted Brash with his final upgrade, a love enhancer, which isn't described in further detail in the game, but very much lends itself to your theory, Rob, that Rimworld is definitely best played as a 2D experience. The love enhancer increased the satisfaction that Lynx got from their intimate times together to such a degree that it offset the mood debuff she had from being repulsed by Brash's other implants. Their marriage was saved, and they all lived happily ever after. So there it is, the story of Brash, the former pirate and dancer who found love and was responsible for creating beautiful artworks and broadcasting joy to all those around him. And also he had some sort of gross mechanical penis thing.
Memory complete. Uploading memory.
Thanks for listening to The Memory Game. If you would like to share a gaming memory with us, ask us a question or send us your thoughts, you can contact us at memorygamepod@gmail.com or on Instagram @memorygamepod.